The eye is a remarkable organ, and eyesight is an amazing gift that we sometimes take for granted. Imagine living life without sight and little or no access to medical help. People in the third world are being helped to see again. I'm Val Jeffrey for The Better Part. Stay tuned. Most of us cringe at the thought of touching our eyes, but my guest touches eyes and lives every day. His volunteer work in Ethiopia restored sight to many who could have remained in the dark for their lifetime. His credentials are numerous, but if I tell you that he graduated first in his class when receiving his undergraduate degree, was Medical Student of the Year when graduating from med school, and did more cataract surgeries than any other when completing his residency, you'll get the picture about the quality of the care he gives. And he's a humanitarian, as you're about to find out. Our guest today is local surgeon, Dr. Huck Holz. Welcome to The Better Part, Dr. Holz.
Thank you.
Why are you so passionate about eyes?
It goes back to my undergraduate days. I had a fine arts background, and in fact, when I applied to medical school, I also applied to film school. And I decided to go to medical school, luckily. But I really always was looking for that outlet, that creative outlet, and I found it in the ophthalmology world. And so this job is not only delicate, it's a fine art, and it's also just exacting work where I get to use my hands and my creativity. It's also fascinated me from the very start.
What surgeries do you perform here at Kaiser Santa Clara?
I do a lot of cataract surgery. I do LASIK. I do cornea transplant work, and I suture in lenses that dislocate. That's the bulk of my practice.
What inspired you to get involved in the Third World projects?
In 2006, I started working with Dr. Jeff Tabin at University of Utah at the Moran Eye Center. He took me under his wing as his fellow, and I started working in Nepal with him later that year. I was taught his fantastic surgery. It's called SICS, or small incision extracapsular surgery, and this is a procedure that we apply to the eyes in the developing world, where we don't have our really expensive phacoemulsification units. And I was enthralled with it and have been running with it ever since.
Which countries have you visited to do your work?
I started out in Nepal with him in 2006, and after completing fellowship, I went to Ghana. I spent 6 weeks there. I then spent the subsequent year time in Uganda. I've been to Ethiopia 4 times now, most recently Zimbabwe, Tanzania, and Kenya.
Which was the year that you did this particular mission?
Actually, this is a combination of a couple different trips. Every time I go, I take my own photographs, and I really enjoy that aspect of it. This is work down here from about 2010, I believe, and then the others are from subsequent trips.
What led you to expand the project to Ethiopia in the first place?
So we began working in Nepal, and after a number of years, we ended up running out of cataract volume. We made a sustainable model there, and they didn't need us anymore. We thought that was going to be a lifetime project. So we started looking for work to do elsewhere. We ended up in Africa, first in Ghana, and we started expanding into other countries. Ethiopia was just a hotbed of young ophthalmologists who were very interested in learning. We expanded cornea transplant techniques into their projects, and it's been just a wonderful place to work. We've enjoyed the people there, and so we really found that to be a great place to develop eye care.
The 2011 visit there What were the main purposes of the trip? Were they all for cataracts, or did you do other things as well?
So whenever we go, we generally, and this goes for most of the projects that we do, we generally do cataracts. We'll do 600, 1,000, sometimes a few more. And at the end of the trip, we like to add in some cornea transplant work. And so that's been something we've been expanding into these eye care models. We want to teach the locals how to, our university partners there, how to do the cornea transplant work. There's a lot of interest in that country in particular. And so we've been spending probably a day or two after we're finished with our cataract work, spending time with the locals and imparting the cornea transplant knowledge.
Well, this is a good time to see the video. With kind permission of Cure Blindness, the organization that sponsored this project, we have a short video that sets the scene. So let's take a look.
I'm from California. I've come to Ethiopia to do some work with Jeffrey Tabin in his Himalayan Cataract Project. And I'm proud and happy to be here and looking forward to hopefully about 1,000 cataracts ahead of me in the week to come, and looking forward to it. The camp functions in a very, very efficient fashion. What we do is we collect people from the countryside, as many as we can possibly recruit with problems like cataract and pterygium, and we intend to treat as many as we possibly can. You'll basically sit for a good 12 hours a day and operate on as many patients as you can possibly work on that day. And we do it in sort of an assembly line fashion in a way that we can treat efficiently and effectively as many people as we can possibly come across. If I were home, I would have just a vast array of instruments to be able to use to tackle this sort of problem, and more time. Here, I'm faced with a ton of patients, as well as limited instrumentation, and potentially a language barrier between me and my nurse. Particularly the ones you remember are the ones who've had, really bad traumatic cataracts, or they're blind, or they're young, they're kids. So certain features do stand out, and then you look for them the next day with excitement to see how they've done. And you look for that sort of moment of joy when they take off the patch and they can see and they haven't seen in years. That's really an incredible moment, and that's why we come.
You said in the video, we collected people from the local countryside. Explain what goes into the process of gathering the patients.
So initially, when we started doing these projects, the people would just walk in, sometimes 6 days, and they'd be led by a family member. They'd come with a couple of chickens, a pineapple or two, and it was amazing. They would make it on these long journeys. And so now we've evolved to the point where we try to facilitate their coming in, and it's much less dangerous for them to walk in to the bus stop as opposed to six days worth of travel. And so now what we do is we send out sort of a wagon wheel of buses, pick people up from the countryside. They spend about a week with us there in the eye camp, and then we cart them back.
There were so many of them, and it was so well organized. How many staff were assigned to each surgeon, and were any of them local people?
So one of the great things about our project in Ethiopia is that we have a partnership with locals. And so we try to approach a university or other colleagues over there, and they bring their staff. We sometimes import staff from other regions of Ethiopia, and they'll come and help us in the operating rooms. We usually have about 4 people surrounding us in the operating room, for instance. There's somebody there who's sort of circulating, somebody there who's handing us instruments, somebody there who's sterilizing instruments, and then somebody who's sort of bringing patients on and off the bed. That's usually per surgeon, and we'll bring a couple people from the United States, but for the most part, these are local people who are helping their own people.
How many people went on the mission? Do you know?
So from the United States, usually it's about 3 or 4 of us. It's not a lot of us. If there's people who have an interest, I'll generally take them. But for the most part, we're working with local surgeons, local staff members, and sometimes we even import people from Nepal who are really good organizers who will help us run these camps.
Mm. Do you have to take equipment with you?
We bring some equipment. Generally, you need a microscope. You need some consumables, so that means lenses. You need some drapes. You need some equipment like betadine or iodine to sterilize the eyes. You need eye drops. So much of this equipment we have imported from either Nepal or India, and then we have our own microscopes. We bring those, and a lot of times we'll buy a microscope, have it shipped there, and then we'll leave it there with the surgeon, so that encourages them to do outreach work afterwards.
What about the lenses and the other supplies? Any of them donated? How does that work?
As for the lenses, initially we didn't implant lenses, and it was the Fred Hollis Foundation that started making these lenses. So in Nepal, they built a factory, and the factory was responsible for making these lenses for most of the undeveloped world, and they also subsequently started making them in India and then in China. So we now import these lenses into Africa from either India or Nepal, where we have our factory. And these lenses cost about $1 to $3 a piece to make. And we bring enough for everyone. They come in different steps or different powers, and we implant them. Here, we take out the cataract, going through a smaller incision on the cornea here. This is the lens, the cloudy lens, which is removed, and in its place, we place a new lens in the capsule. And all of this work is actually done through the cornea here, through a small incision.
But everyone needs different power lenses, so you must have to take extra ones to make sure you've got the right ones.
Sure, it's like shoe sizes. So it's a bell curve. Most people have a certain power they need, and then there's outliers on either end of the bell curve, and so we have to guesstimate what we're going to need, what our needs will be over there. So we bring more than enough, and we ended up leaving the remainder there for the surgeons who want to do outreach work in the future. We also do lens measurements when we're there, which helps determine which power to put in someone's eye to help them see optimally.
Do you have a preliminary meeting with the person before you do the operation? You can't just do the operation. I guess what I'm trying to say is, when are you first involved with the patient before you actually operate on them?
So we have translators, and for something like a cornea transplant, we need to speak with them. We need to understand what they're looking into. We need to understand what they want to get out of it, and they need to understand what the risks are. For something like a cataract surgery, that's pretty much standardized at this point. We have translators speak with them about what the risks, the benefits, and alternatives are, and we need to help them understand the process, how to lay still on the bed and such. So that's really not something the surgeon ends up doing. We have people who do that almost like a class. One of the problems over there that we run into is language barriers. And sometimes even my assistant, who is who speaks Amharic doesn't know the language in these local areas. A lot of different languages in the remote areas in Ethiopia. So we have to rely on people who can help us with this consultation.
Yes. What's the biggest challenge operating under the conditions you have to in Ethiopia versus here at Kaiser?
Well, there are many challenges, and also there's some benefits too. So you have a microscope that costs about $16,000 as opposed to about $250,000. There's a big difference there. A lot of times some of your seating arrangements are not ergonomic and you're sort of hunched over all day, and these are like 12-hour days. So I mean you're working fast and furiously all day, and so if you sit in an awkward position, it can be pretty bad for your body. So I definitely have to stretch out every night and every morning after I spend a day behind the microscope. It's also hot sometimes in the operating rooms. The air conditioner doesn't reliably work. We have a language barrier between me and the nurse sometimes that I'm working with, and there's also issues with patient flow. If if our train of patients gets somehow interrupted, our supply chain, then you're maybe going to do 60 to 100 in a day, and if something slows you down, like the autoclave breaks or things happen, then you may only do 30 or 40 in a day, and then you're looking at more work the next day and probably expanding the length of your stay.
Really is pioneering work.
Yeah, it definitely, I've worked in schoolhouses, I've worked in churches and small little hospitals in the remote countryside. It tends to be pretty rustic when we go, but that's what makes it exciting.
Very rewarding as well for what you do. Now, we usually associate cataracts with the elderly, and yet there were children in that video. So what proportion of patients are children?
It's probably only about 1 to 2%. But those 1 to 2% of cataracts are some of the most gratifying for me. When you do an adult's cataract, they get to go back into the community and help. They're an extra set of hands. They're no longer what the locals call a mouth without hands. So they get to help the grandkids and such. But if you restore sight in a child, they really get to go to school and learn like the others. They can make so much more of their lives, and just the overall lifespan, the impact that you make is so much greater because their lifespan is so much longer. The surgeries on children are much more difficult. They have to be sedated, so they take a lot longer, as opposed to the adults where we just give them a local block or local anesthesia. Children don't understand what you're doing, so you definitely have to put them to sleep, so they take a lot longer. So we can't do the volume. So in the impact in the camp is that it actually takes about a whole day of our time to do maybe 8 to 12 kids.
Yeah, but the benefits to those kids will last their lifetime. So
absolutely, it's incredibly gratifying.
Yeah. Let's talk about some specific cases. There's stories with each case, and some of them must have made an impression on you. I believe, is this a little girl here?
She looks like a little, in her 20s, and she had just given birth.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
So she had white cataracts in both eyes. This was from the first trip I made to Ethiopia, and she had a young daughter who was just an infant, and if you're blind in both eyes and you're caring for an infant in the remote countryside, doing animal husbandry, you're cooking over an open fire. This is difficult circumstances if you can't see, if next to impossible. So if you can see that picture there, she's tearful, and she was just absolutely thankful. And it was one of the most satisfying cataract surgeries I've done.
Would that have been the first time she saw her child, or would she have seen?
That was. She developed the cataracts in utero, so she hadn't seen her child. She had white cataracts in both eyes, so she could see whether the light was on or the light was off, and that was it.
Yeah. And what about this? I hope he's a little boy and he's not 100 years old.
That's a little boy who had a cataract. The incidence of field work injuries and kids that play with sticks and such is pretty high there. He had a stick injury in the left eye there. Oh. And so these traumatic cataracts can be challenging to do, but also gratifying, because these kids oftentimes have a formed retinal image when they're youngsters. So when you take the cataract out, they actually see, and they do quite well. So again, very satisfying work.
Yeah. And what about this lady here?
So it's difficult to get an age approximation on some of these patients, but we think she was probably about 98. And it's tough to survive out in the remote countryside into your 90s and to make a living. And she came in and she was just sort of one of these magical faces. And again, going back to my fine arts background, I love taking photographs of these people. These are people I would never otherwise see. They come out of the woodwork and they just have these beautiful adornments and just this amazing wizened look. And she was just somebody who sort of touched me. I had to take my series of photos there that day. She went back into the countryside and hopefully lived out her remainder of her years doing her cooking over her campfire in a much easier fashion. So you find that some of these people come in with lots of physical injuries on their hands and their feet sometimes because they can't see where they're going. And just life is just absolutely difficult if you can't see in that kind of environment.
Yeah. Your photos tell the story. Look at that face there. It's beautiful. What about a patient that touched you the most?
I think the ones that touch me the most are the ones I have most contact with. I spent my birthday there a number of years ago in Ethiopia, and I went out on my birthday, I wanted to go see some of the rural villages. And so we drove out to a village that was by car 3 hours away. And this was before we were doing the buses. So I met a gentleman out there who was living in this very remote area, and it was a very rocky village. It was a town that was at the top of a little mountain, and it was all terraced with rocks. They had animals living in the village with them. They had open fire pits and very rough and rugged terrain right around the village. And I met this gentleman, and he said, I had this eye done 2 years ago, and that's when I had been there previously. Mm-hmm. And I'm so happy with the results, and we got this through translation. Now I can take my cows into market, and I can cook for people. And he kept showing us the whole village. He kept bringing us around, showing us everything he'd built and everything he'd done since then. And the thing that really struck him the most was the food. He said, the food that you guys provided was so good. So, that was probably the most satisfying, because I really realized on that day how much of an impact you can have over there. People's, rough and rugged existence, they have to eke out a living in such terrible circumstances.
That was a wonderful birthday present.
Right. Very meaningful.
How long does it take for eyes to heal? And who monitors the patients once the team's left?
So it takes about a week or so for things to fully heal. After the patients leave us, and we do keep them for 3 days, so we administer antibiotics there for 3 days. We feed them meanwhile. And the eyes have healed enough at that point where we know that they can go back to their villages and not have any subsequent problems. But during the post-operative period, there are just precautions they have to take. They have to basically take it easy and not do any heavy lifting and such back at the village, and we teach them how to do hand hygiene and such. The aftercare, though, is pretty minimal.
In Ethiopia, why do so many people of all ages have cataracts?
So there's a high cataract burden there for a couple of reasons. One is they live at high altitude. A lot of these villages are 8,000 feet. The other reasons are nutrition, age, and generally there's a lot of sunlight exposure there too. They're outdoors all day. But beyond that, there's just a lot of cataract backlog because no one was there doing cataract surgery. So there's just a lot of need there.
Yeah. There was a young Ethiopian woman in the local team, and she was very moved by what you were doing. Tell us about Yodit.
Oh, Yodit is my assistant at work, and she is fantastic. She came with me on my first trip to Ethiopia after hearing that I was going. She said, "You're not going without me." And so she's been my translator, my caretaker over there, and she's basically can do any role, and so she often does wears many hats at once over there. So after our initial work, she started working with me in my clinic, and it's been just a fantastic bond ever since.
Mm-hmm. I love happy stories, and it's nice to have a wonderful story to close the program. So I want to thank you for the wonderful photographs and the ones that are going to be inserted in this show. And I'm really glad that your hobby is photography as well. So thank you for being our guest, and thank you for being an ambassador for America and for all the great work you've done.
My pleasure.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Without these humanitarian missions, many people in the third world are destined to live life without sight, which impacts their whole life and livelihood. These missions send a strong message to the world that we here in America care. Thank you for watching. Join us again.
Particularly the ones you remember are the ones who've had, really bad traumatic cataracts, or they're blind, or they're young, they're kids. So certain features do stand out, and then you look for them the next day with excitement to see how they've done. And you look for that sort of moment of joy when they take off the patch and they can see, and they haven't seen in years. That's really an incredible moment, and that's why we come.